Welcome to the final week of Cyber Chats here at CyberBytes Foundation. This week we have Ed Bassett, CISO for Neo Systems, and him and I discuss the current state of CMMC and the steps you need to take to start getting prepared. Before we jump into that conversation, I would like to thank Glenn Gulias, AJ Orr, Charlie Tupitza, and Ed Bassett, as well as our own CyberBytes Foundation internal staff for all of their support in helping us record and put on these chats over the last month. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and it's been our pleasure to bring you discussions related around emerging technology and cybersecurity. So I hope you enjoy my discussion with Ed Bassett, CISO, Neosystems. Welcome to CyberBytes Cyber Chats. I'm here with Ed Bassett, CISO for Neosystems. Ed has 30 years experience in pretty much all aspects of security and privacy programs, and he's going to be here updating us on the latest with CMMC and what Neosystems is doing in support of CMMC. Ed, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it.
So I guess what is the latest with CMMC? They went dark for a while, and it seems like they've kind of emerged from the bushes a little bit, and people are starting to really get ramped up with the new thing. So what is the latest?
We waited around for a while. So I don't know if it was dark necessarily, but definitely people were curious to see kind of how this was going to be implemented. But there was a wait for the new DFARS clauses to come out. The DFARS being sort of the contractual way that CMMC comes into reality. So that was released a few weeks ago. So we now have it in our hands, and we can look at it. I can start with a little bit of a rundown on how that's changed the landscape, if you want. I mean, CMMC has been out there now since January, draft versions even earlier than that. So I think people have all kind of looked at the standard, but the question then was, how is this really going to roll out and affect me?
Exactly. So with the new rules coming out, how is that going to start affecting the contractors, and what do they need to start doing now if they've kind of been sitting on the sidelines and not making moves?
If people were waiting for the clauses to kind of see the legal aspect, one that's out now, you can see it, so that wait is over, and it doesn't encourage sitting on the sidelines. I'll just say it that way. Let me give a quick rundown, I guess, of what we have in there. So for starters, the current requirements that are in the DFARS, I'll just rattle off some of the numbers here, but the DFARS 252.204-7012. So that's the current requirement for security of covered contractor information systems. That requirement is unchanged, and that requires compliance with the NIST SP 800-171, requires use of some FedRAMP clouds for cloud hosting of any covered contractor information systems, requires flow down to subcontractors, requires some incident reporting. All those things are unchanged. So if you were somehow wishfully thinking that those requirements would go away, then that is not the case. What's been added to that are CMMC, of course, as expected, was added to that, but maybe surprising to some is that there's been sort of an early requirement added to beef up enforcement of those existing requirements. So there's two new clauses, same numbers, 252.204, but the dash is -7019 and -7020. So the first of those requires that contractors do a self-assessment of their compliance. And that's for all their covered information systems. So that's any information system that stores or processes basically CUI, controlled unclassified information, or other covered defense information. They have to do the self-assessment of those systems and report that score to the DoD. So DoD has set up a supplier performance risk system. It's called SPRS, and that score must be uploaded to that system prior to contract award. The second of those clauses, the -7020 clause, permits the DoD to do some more detailed assessments. So this is the DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. DIBCAC has been doing some assessments. Now they have a DFARS enablement clause that permits them to do that on any contracts that have this clause in it. It also prohibits awards for anyone who doesn't have a self-assessment on file. So that could be your self-assessment, it could be the government audit if you're lucky or unlucky enough to get one of those, and it requires some flow down of those requirements to subcontractors. So those two things taken together really have nothing to do with CMMC. They're really all about enforcement of the existing requirements around the NIST 800-171, incident reporting, et cetera, and making sure that people are taking that seriously. So anybody who was sitting on the sidelines and has not yet finished that compliance, should definitely step up and take care of that right away. Those clauses do still allow for a plan of action and milestones, a POAM. So if you have some things that are not done, your score is not perfect, you can still submit that score, and but the government is requiring you to include a date by which you're going to be compliant, fully compliant. So you do have to commit to the date that's in your POAM. And then the last of the three clauses that just came out is dash 7021. So it's 252.204-7021. And that clause is the CMMC clause. That's what brings CMMC into being. And it's going to be selectively added to contracts over the next 5 years. So that clause requires that you have a CMMC certification at an appropriate level prior to taking award. And other than that, doesn't make any real fundamental changes to the CMMC program. It just defines how it's going to be rolled out contractually, and sort of codifies the idea that you have to flow that down to your subcontractors. So again, back to your comment about people waiting on the sidelines. Those first two, 7019 and 7020, those are going to be appearing in all contracts that are awarded after November 30th of this year. So that means if you have a renewal or a new contract you're bidding on, you're going to see that requirement for score reporting, that your NIST 800-171 compliance score will need to be reported on all those new prior to award of all those new contracts starting in November. So CMMC is rolling out over 5 years, as we all expected. That's been announced widely by the DoD, but these new reporting requirements take effect, again, all new contracts after November 30th.
Gotcha. How do you see, with the different levels within CMMC, level 1 through level 5, how are you seeing that this new enforcement of the old policy is going to affect companies that may only need a level 1 or a level 2 versus the full scope of NIST 800-171, which in all the controls?
So the old policy, or the existing policy, I shouldn't say old necessarily, but the existing policy only applies to covered contractor information systems. So that's systems that contain covered defense information. Typically, that's controlled unclassified information, or CUI. So for contractors who don't have any of those systems, then those existing requirements essentially have no effect. So they don't have any action under the existing requirements or these new requirements that start on November 30th, because they don't have any covered contractor information systems. So CMMC, on the other hand, is not specific to those kind of systems. It's at an organizational level, and it includes requirements for systems that would not be considered covered contractor information systems under the current rule. So for systems that have, for example, federal contract information, or FCI, that would require CMMC level 1. Now today, those systems are covered under some clauses in the FAR, in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, that has some practices in there that are required for all systems with FCI. So the CMMC requirements are roughly equivalent. There's 17 items in there. They're roughly equivalent to the current FAR requirements. Not a big change in the bar. So I think if clients are thinking about how CMMC raises the bar or changes the bar, for the systems with FCI, they'll need CMMC level 1. That's not a big change from what's in the FAR today. For systems with CUI in them, those current requirements, NIST 800-171 has most of the things that we see in CMMC level 3. So it has 110 of the 130 things that CMMC level 3 has. So CMMC is going to add 20 new practices, plus it brings the requirement for maturity. So there's some formal maturity requirements in CMMC, and of course the requirement for independent audit, independent assessment and certification is brand new under CMMC.
Awesome. Now with the new regulations out, are we still going to have the pre-announcement of which contracts are going to be susceptible to CMMC over the next 5 years? I know that there was like 10 or something in the rollout year. We're expecting a pretty aggressive rollout of that going forward.
So the DoD has announced that they're doing some small, relatively small number of Pathfinder contracts in this current year, and the exact name of those and the exact timing of those has not been announced yet. So still waiting to see if people are involved in one of those. And then they've given some projections of the number that they're going to roll this into. So they've given us for each fiscal year, how many contracts are going to have it. The key is, even if you're not a prime on one of those contracts, if you're a supplier or subordinate, down somewhere deeper in the supply chain, you may still have it. So it's really difficult for people to know exactly when am I going to need CMMC at this point.
Now, is that where, with what you're doing at Neosystems, comes into play, that somebody can reach out to you and say, hey, I need help with this? What exactly are you doing there in support of this?
So as I mentioned, the current requirements and the CMMC requirements are not all that far apart, right? So for people who are looking at CMMC and saying, hey, we still have a ways to go to get there, there's definitely an urgency, because for the most part, the ground they need to cover is to meet a current requirement. As we're seeing, stepped up enforcement. I think, so even if you believe I won't need to have an actual CMMC certification for 2, maybe 3 years, there is a very high likelihood that you're going to have to report your score under these new requirements, right? If you have any covered contractor information systems whatsoever, if you store and process any CUI, then that's going to be a near-term requirement for essentially everyone. So what we're doing at Neosystems is really making sure that people are in fact ready. One of the big motivators for CMMC, for all these new clauses, was a finding that despite the requirements in the DFARS having been in place now for a few years, the implementation is rather spotty. And that's not because people don't want to do the right thing or because they're somehow skirting the law. It's because the interpretation of what that means varies widely. CMMC goes quite a ways in helping to clarify that, but one of the things we're doing is helping to make sure people really understand what systems are covered, where's their data, what are the requirements mean, are the things that they're doing that they maybe think are compliant, are they actually complying with the letter of the law, meaning would it pass a CMMC audit when that time comes? So, for us, that's about making sure that those security programs are up to speed, and where they're not, taking folks there, right? So our model as a service provider is to take on the compliance burden and make sure that we are driving the security program for our customer. Most of our customers don't have the luxury of having cybersecurity expertise on staff. They're small and mid-sized businesses, so they are likely all following the CMMC requirements and are familiar with it because it's been in the news a lot. But in terms of having access to the expertise to take those sort of abstract requirements from the government and translate it into reality on the ground for their IT systems, that's something that they often need some expertise with. So we want to be, a trusted partner with them and not just advise them, but also drive that towards success and make sure that they're meeting the requirements that are in place today and ready for CMMC assessment when that requirement kicks in.
So does your process usually start with just an overall gap analysis of what they have in place, and then you come back with the solution of either internal processes and procedures and additional tool sets? What does your workflow look like when you engage with someone?
Certainly gap analysis is a piece of that, right? Seeing what is in place today versus what the current requirements are. Other big pieces of that early work are understanding which systems are covered, where is the data, looking at data flows within an organization. And sometimes that's very uncertain as to which systems actually store and process which types of data. The data is not always clearly labeled by the government. It's not always clearly labeled by contractors when they produce the data. So having an understanding of that from a data flow perspective and understanding how the systems are laid out. Often our customers need to make some trade-offs as far as what systems they want to bring into compliance with federal regulations. If the data that we're talking about, this controlled and classified information, is kind of ubiquitous throughout their enterprise, then they may want all their systems to be compliant. If their DoD work is a small portion of their business, then they may want to isolate that in a secure enclave. And CMMC, as well as the current requirements, they all permit that, right? They permit you to put the CUI, or the sensitive data, the federal data, into selected systems and then those are the systems where the protections need to apply. So early on, yes, gap analysis, some data flow analysis, understanding of the IT architecture, and looking at how to segment that if in fact that's something that it would be a money saver for our clients.
With the clients that you've engaged, what do you see is probably the most common deficiency that you need to correct within an organization?
I think on the security side of things, there's a lot of possibilities. I think the more overriding element that we see is what I'll call deferred IT maintenance, right? Is that their IT systems are not ready for this level of security and this level of cybersecurity maturity. So if you think about it in the sense of, okay, we're going to overlay some security onto our existing systems, that may be difficult or impossible depending on the age of those systems, how those systems are managed. So that often we find this is not just a security overlay, but really drives thinking about a transformation of their IT posture and potentially changing out the systems themselves, potentially changing out how those systems are managed and operated on a day-to-day basis to bring that into compliance with CMMC. So example there would be configuration management and hardening, making sure that those systems every change to those systems is done in a controlled way. That's not a management technique that a lot of small businesses need for operational effectiveness. So if you think about a large organization, they're going to have a formal change management process because they have a hugely complex IT footprint and a lot of people working on it, and then chaos would ensue if they didn't have a control for that. But a small organization, typically it's a handful of computers and one or maybe a couple people who are managing it. So institutional knowledge of how everything is set up is sufficient. It keeps the wheels on, it keeps the things running. It's not sufficient to meet CMMC requirements. So trying to add some of that practice again to existing IT footprint is causing people to rethink, should we move things to the cloud? Should we change what kind of things we're actually trying to manage? If they've been getting by with very old systems that are not getting vendor support, maybe difficult or impossible to put patches on. So, maybe drive a need for some modernization.
Yeah, absolutely. How much organizational culture resistance do you meet for places that have, that you just talked about? They've got outdated systems, legacy systems in place. They've been resistant to put budgets in to keep things updated. Where now they're getting this new regulation forced to them that's just resistant, not just from the amount of money that they may need to spend, but also from a process and procedure change that's going to flip how they do business, that they just see it as burdensome. Is this something that you're running across?
We see it somewhat. I mean, there's certainly concern about the cost burden by many companies in the sense that this is a new cost, and the government has announced it as such. They've talked about this as being a requirement to do something that wasn't required before. They've estimated the costs involved, and they've said these are allowable costs under contracts. But nonetheless, that's a big concern for a lot of, especially smaller businesses, where that this kind of capital investment or ongoing operational expenses is a big deal to them. And so that's one concern is, understanding how that cost can be kept under control. I guess what I don't see is pushback on the concept of, is this even needed, right? I don't know that I hear people saying, well, we think our systems are plenty secure without all this. And, I think people recognize that our adversaries, very well-funded, very highly skilled adversaries, are eating our lunch. I mean, they're successfully stealing our intellectual property, and it's affecting national security. So I think that's been well documented enough that I think most people that we're talking with have a good understanding of that. Now, our experience is probably biased towards early adopters, right? The people who are talking to us as a managed security service provider and asking for our help in getting them compliant are the ones who are ahead of the curve. They're not the stragglers. They're not the ones who are thinking this is all going to go away and they don't have to really deal with it. So, maybe I have a biased audience, but for the most part, those folks are receptive to the fact that this needs to be done. They're looking for ways to do it in a way that's least disruptive. And that means obviously least impact on their budget, but also looking for ways to have that not be disruptive to the users in their experience of using IT. And that's why I guess I'll go back a little bit to the IT transformation. In some cases, adding security to existing systems might be more expensive and more disruptive than modernizing and moving that, to some other areas. So that's a bit of, I think, a bit of a surprise for us that there's more IT work in what would otherwise be thought of as probably just a security overlay project.
For anybody that has, this may be the first time that they've come across this, they've seen CMMC, haven't paid attention. They said, "I'll get to it when I get to it." What would be the very first thing that you would advise them to do?
If they haven't looked at it before, I would say they should start by taking a quick assessment of their systems and saying, what systems do I have that are going to need CMMC level 3 NIST 800-171? So that's the higher of the bar, right? So I mentioned systems that don't have any CUI or covered defense information in them, they need to meet the FAR requirements. It's CMMC level 1. That's a pretty low bar. Most people have that for their systems anyway, and maybe they make a couple of tweaks to bring that into alignment. But for systems that have the CUI in them, the lift is pretty significant above what I'll call kind of common commercial practice. Meaning, if you haven't seen this and you haven't been paying attention and you haven't been on a path of compliance before, it's very likely that you have some significant gaps. So step one is, where's that data and what are those systems? What systems need this? And once you have a handle on that, then the next step is, you mentioned earlier, is gap analysis and going through those controls. I would say for most systems that, again, have not had a concerted effort on them, the number of gaps is significant, maybe half. I'm somewhat estimating that, it varies, but it's probably not one or two things. It's probably 40 or 50 things. If that's shocking to people, maybe. But there's, for those systems that have not had a concerted effort put on them to align with these requirements, the lift is fairly significant.
Yeah, and I would throw in, from my own personal experiences working with some small and medium size, documentation is typically poor. Asset management, what's on the network, topology, running across that. Definitely no security plan in place. And seeing if those kind of core items were even developed to have that framework to even be.
And that comment earlier that I made was, these things are not operationally necessary for small and mid-sized businesses. Sure. So to keep the wheels on the bus and to keep users happy and to keep business progressing forward, you don't need extensive security documentation. You need the extensive security documentation to keep the bad guys out. You need the security documentation to have reliable processes that you can demonstrate to an auditor and get a certification. So those are the drivers, right? The operational necessity is really not there. So most companies don't have those already in place unless they've already been working their way down this path. So yeah, for companies that have not started, that's always a big factor. Even for companies who have security policies in place, most people don't have nothing, right? But for most companies, as we come in as a service provider, one of the early things we want to do is get those foundational documents in place, making sure that everything that's happening, either currently happening or supposed to be happening in the future, is documented, and making sure that we have a really good understanding of what that evidence of compliance needs to be. So that's one of our functions as a service provider, is to curate that evidence. So if we're doing the security control because it's something that customers have purchased from us, then obviously that's driven in a mature and compliant way, because we've built these all from the ground up to be compliant and pass audit. But if the client is providing it themselves, say they've got in-house IT staff doing certain functions, hardening, patching, then again, in most cases, even if that function is occurring today, it's typically not well documented. So we'll make sure that it is documented and that the evidence that it's happening is collected and curated and ready to show to an auditor. That's going to be a big lift, I think, for a lot of folks, is submitting this to an external third party. Everything we've seen before has been self-attestation, and now these new rules is self-assessment. It's much different looking at your own practices and believing in them enough to check the box yes, than it is to convince someone else, and that someone else isn't about convincing them by giving them a nice story. It's only allowed, they only can allow you to convince them by presenting hard evidence, and so that's a big part of the process. So documentation and then the evidence that backs up that those documents are actually being followed in practice.
Excellent. Well, Ed, I really appreciate your time today. For anybody that wants to reach out to Neosystems to get support with their CMMC requirements and touch base, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best way for sure is to go to our website. It's neosystemscorp.com. So neosystemscorp.com. We have some really good resources there for folks that are wanting to learn about CMMC and these new DFARS clauses. We do a lot of recorded sessions and live sessions that are intended as community outreach. So just go to the resources section of our website, and that will lead you to some of that educational material. And then, of course, if you're needing help in starting down or continuing down the journey to compliance, then look at our services. We have solutions that are designed to really shepherd you the entire way along this path to compliance.
Excellent. Well, Ed, thanks, and I appreciate it. Look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.